Welcome back to Channel 19 Mysteries. I'm your host, Midnight Rider. If you were to take a drive through the rugged, windswept landscape of South Yorkshire in England, you would eventually find yourself navigating the winding, undulating roads that border the Peak District. It is a place of stark, isolated natural beauty, where the rolling, ancient moors stretch out as far as the eye can see, blanketed in thick heather and jagged, moss-covered stone. The air up there is often thick with a biting chill, and when the fog rolls in off the hills, it swallows the landscape whole, reducing visibility to mere feet. But hidden within this picturesque, albeit foreboding, countryside is a stretch of asphalt that has earned a reputation so deeply chilling and so thoroughly terrifying that local law enforcement, hardened construction workers, and veteran lorry drivers actively refuse to travel it alone at night. This is the A616, better known to the locals as the Stocksbridge Bypass. And the events that unfolded upon this road, and the horrors that began before the asphalt was even fully laid, remain some of the most well-documented and profoundly unsettling paranormal encounters in modern history. To truly understand the sheer terror that grips this particular stretch of highway, you have to understand the land it was built upon, and the desperate reasons it was built in the first place. For generations, the town of Stocksbridge, situated just northwest of Sheffield, was the beating heart of the local steel industry. Dominated by the sprawling Samuel Fox and Company steelworks, the town was nestled deep within a narrow, steep-sided valley. By the 1980s, the steelworks were churning out massive quantities of materials, which meant an endless, grinding procession of heavy goods vehicles and massive transport lorries rumbling through the town's tight Victorian-era streets day and night. The noise was deafening, the pollution was suffocating, and the danger to local pedestrians was constant. The local council knew they had a crisis on their hands. The only solution was to carve a brand new road straight through the untouched hillsides above the valley, effectively bypassing the town altogether and giving the heavy lorries a direct route to the M1 motorway. In the mid-1980s, a staggering £14 million budget was approved, and the earth-moving machines of the McAlpine Construction Company arrived. They began to violently tear into the ancient earth, slicing through crags, uprooting centuries-old trees, and moving millions of tons of soil and rock to forge the path for the new A616. But the locals whispered that the construction crews were digging into places that were never meant to be disturbed. The moorlands above Sheffield have a deep, rich, and often tragic history. Long before the steel mills dominated the skyline, this land was heavily mined. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it was common practice for young children to be sent deep into the subterranean darkness to work in the cramped, suffocating coal pits. Tragic cave-ins and mining disasters were a grim reality of the era, and many children lost their lives beneath the very hills the bypass was now cutting through. Furthermore, the land adjacent to the new road's route was once the domain of the Hunshelf Priory in the Middle Ages. Local lore, passed down through generations, spoke of a deeply disillusioned monk who had broken his sacred vows, committed a grievous sin, and fallen out of favor with the church. When he died, he was denied a holy burial. Instead, he was cast out and buried in an unmarked, unhallowed grave somewhere on the desolate hillside. When the heavy machinery of the 1980s began to aggressively churn up that exact hillside, it seemed to serve as a catalyst. Whatever was resting beneath the soil of the Peak District was suddenly and violently woken up. By the autumn of 1987, the bypass was well underway, but it was still an active, messy construction site. Because the site was littered with millions of pounds worth of heavy machinery, raw materials, and tools, it became a prime target for thieves. To combat this, the McAlpine Company hired private security to patrol the desolate stretches of the unfinished road through the dead of night. Enter David Goldthorpe and Stephen Brooks. These were not men prone to flights of fancy, nor were they easily spooked. They were classic, down-to-earth South Yorkshire lads. They were massive, physically imposing men. One of them was an active rugby player and a dedicated weightlifter. They had dealt with aggressive trespassers, drunken vandals, and violent thieves without breaking a sweat. To them, guarding a dirt road in the middle of nowhere was an easy, albeit incredibly boring, paycheck. But that completely changed. On the night of Tuesday, September 8th, 1987, it was approximately 12:30 a.m. The night was bitterly cold, the kind of damp, piercing chill that seeps through heavy winter coats and settles deep into your bones. David and Stephen were sitting in the heated cab of their company Land Rover, slowly bumping along the unpaved gravel of Pea Royd Lane, a section of the site near the massive steelworks. The headlights of the 4x4 cut through the thick, swirling mist, illuminating the skeletal framework of the half-finished highway. As they approached a massive, towering electricity pylon that loomed over the construction site like an iron giant, David, who was driving, suddenly eased off the gas. He leaned forward, squinting through the windshield into the gloom. Stephen sat up straight, his eyes scanning the darkness. Over the low, steady rumble of the Land Rover's diesel engine, they could hear something deeply out of place. It was a high-pitched, melodic sound. It sounded exactly like the echoing, joyful voices of young children singing. David stopped the vehicle. The two massive men sat in the cab, absolutely bewildered. They were miles away from any residential housing. The terrain was treacherous, filled with deep mud, heavy equipment, and sheer drops. It was pitch black, freezing cold, and half past midnight. There was absolutely no rational reason for children to be out here. David slowly rolled down his window, letting the biting wind rush into the cab. The singing instantly became clearer. It was the distinct, rhythmic chant of the classic nursery rhyme, "Ring Around the Roses." The two guards looked toward the base of the massive electricity pylon, their eyes adjusting to the low light. And there, illuminated by the ambient glow of the distant steelworks and the scattered construction lights, they saw them. A group of young children were holding hands, forming a perfect circle in the mud. They were skipping in a continuous loop, singing the rhyme with an eerie, hollow enthusiasm. But what immediately struck both David and Stephen wasn't just the sheer impossibility of the situation. It was what the children were wearing. These weren't kids in modern 1980s winter jackets and sneakers. They were dressed in tattered, incredibly outdated, old-fashioned Victorian-era clothing. The fabrics looked heavy, drab, and completely out of place for the modern decade. For a brief, fleeting moment, the guards' protective instincts kicked in. They assumed this was some sort of bizarre, highly elaborate prank, or perhaps a group of local kids who had gotten dangerously lost on the moors. "Hey!" David shouted out the window, his deep voice booming across the empty valley. "What are you kids doing out here? It's not safe!" The moment the words left his mouth, the children abruptly stopped skipping. The singing ceased instantly. The children turned their heads in unison, looking directly at the idling Land Rover. And then, in the blink of an eye, the children simply ceased to exist. They didn't run away. They didn't dive behind the pylon or duck into the shadows. 1 second, they were standing right there in the mud, staring at the guards, and the very next fraction of a second, the space they occupied was completely empty. They vanished into thin air, exactly like a television being switched off. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the Land Rover. David and Stephen sat frozen, their minds desperately trying to process the impossible physics of what they had just witnessed. Slowly, acting on pure adrenaline, the two men grabbed their heavy flashlights, opened the doors, and stepped out into the freezing wind. They walked cautiously toward the base of the electricity pylon. They swept their flashlight beams over the wet, churned-up earth where the children had just been dancing. There were no footprints. The mud was completely undisturbed. There was absolutely no physical evidence that anyone had been standing there at all. A creeping sense of dread began to wash over the two hardened security guards. They hurried back to the Land Rover, slammed the doors shut, and locked them. They sat in silence for a few minutes, trying to rationalize it. Perhaps the fog had played a trick on their eyes. Perhaps the exhaustion of the night shift was getting to them. They were professionals, and they had a vast site to patrol. Shaken, but determined to finish their shift, David put the truck in gear, and they continued their route. They drove further up the unfinished bypass, heading toward the Pea Royd Bridge, a massive, half-constructed concrete overpass that spanned a deep section of the valley. As the Land Rover slowly crested a small hill approaching the bridge, the headlights swept across the concrete structure. Instantly, both men gasped. Standing dead center on the unfinished bridge was a figure. But this was no child. It was a towering, massive entity, standing impossibly tall. It was draped entirely in a heavy, dark, flowing robe, with a large hood pulled up, completely obscuring its face. It looked exactly like a medieval monk's habit. David, operating purely on instinct, reached down and flicked on the Land Rover's high beams, intending to blind the massive trespasser and demand they leave the site. The blindingly bright halogen lights shot forward, hitting the towering figure dead on. But instead of illuminating the fabric of the robe, the light did something that broke every law of reality. The beams of light passed straight through the center of the figure's torso, brightly illuminating the concrete bridge directly behind it, as if the entity were made of nothing but dark, freezing smoke. The towering, translucent figure slowly, deliberately turned its hooded head toward the Land Rover. In that exact moment, the tough, fearless facade of the two security guards completely shattered. A wave of primal, unadulterated terror slammed into them. These two massive men, who spent their days lifting weights and playing brutal contact sports, absolutely broke down. Panic consumed the cab of the truck. David slammed the gear shift into reverse. He stomped on the accelerator, sending the Land Rover rocketing backward, its heavy tires spinning and violently spitting gravel and mud into the air. He spun the wheel, threw the truck into drive, and they fled the construction site as fast as the engine could carry them, leaving the towering, faceless monk standing alone on the bridge in the dark. Miles away from the site, breathing heavily and trembling uncontrollably, they found a telephone. They dialed their boss, the site manager, Peter Owens. It was the middle of the night when Owens' phone rang. When he picked it up, he expected to hear a routine report of a broken fence or a stolen generator. Instead, he heard the voices of his two toughest employees bordering on total hysteria. They were speaking frantically, their voices cracking with sheer terror. Some accounts state they were so terrified they were openly weeping. Deeply alarmed by their state, Owens immediately threw on his coat and drove out to meet them. When he arrived, he found David and Stephen standing by their vehicle, completely pale, shaking violently, and utterly traumatized. Owens sat them down and listened as they frantically recounted the story of the ghostly Victorian children dancing in the mud and the towering, translucent monk on the bridge. Owens was a pragmatic man. He didn't necessarily believe in ghosts, but as he looked into the wide, terrified eyes of his two best guards, he knew with absolute certainty that they had experienced something deeply horrific. They were completely inconsolable. They flatly refused to ever step foot on the bypass site again. In fact, the trauma was so severe that one of them quit the security profession entirely after just 3 more days, and the other resigned shortly after. Neither of them ever returned to the A616. But the events of that night were far from over. David and Stephen were so deeply horrified, so convinced that a profound evil had infested the construction site, that they didn't just go home to hide. As soon as the sun began to rise, the two massive, exhausted men drove straight to a local church in Stocksbridge. They pounded on the doors until they found the local priest, a man named Stuart Brindley. Imagine the scene from Priest Brindley's perspective. He arrives at his quiet church early in the morning, only to be confronted by 2 giant, physically imposing men who are visibly shaking, pale as ghosts, and bordering on a nervous breakdown. They corner the priest and desperately, vehemently demand that he immediately gather his holy items and perform a full religious exorcism of the McAlpine construction site. Priest Brindley was completely overwhelmed. He listened to their horrifying tale, and while he was sympathetic to their obvious psychological distress, he realized this was a situation that required a different kind of authority. He needed to make sure these men were safe, and he needed someone to officially investigate what was happening on that road. So Priest Brindley picked up the telephone and dialed the Deepcar police station. The call was routed to a highly respected veteran police officer named PC Dick Ellis. PC Ellis listened patiently as the priest explained that he currently had 2 massive, terrified security guards in his church demanding an exorcism because they had seen ghost children and a giant phantom monk on the new bypass. When PC Ellis hung up the phone, he couldn't help but laugh. To a seasoned police officer in South Yorkshire, the idea of two tough guy security guards fleeing from imaginary ghosts was the funniest thing he had heard all week. He assumed it was a prank, or perhaps the guards had been drinking on the job and let their imaginations run wild in the fog. Determined to put the ridiculous rumors to bed, PC Ellis grabbed his colleague, Special Constable John Beat. They decided they would drive up to the Pea Royd Bridge themselves, have a look around, prove there was absolutely nothing there, and close the book on this absurd story. It was the night of Friday, September 11th, 1987, 3 days after the guards had fled for their lives. The night was relatively warm for September, but the sky was pitch black. PC Ellis and Special Constable Beat navigated their standard issue Vauxhall Astra patrol car up the winding dirt paths of the construction site, the tires crunching loudly in the quiet night. They pulled the patrol car to a stop, directly facing the half-constructed Pea Royd Bridge. Because it was a mild night, they rolled down both the driver and passenger side windows, allowing the quiet night air to drift into the cabin. They sat in the dark, chatting quietly, looking at the bridge, fully expecting to see absolutely nothing. A few minutes passed. Then, suddenly, PC Ellis narrowed his eyes. He saw something moving on the bridge. It was a dark shape, shifting in the shadows. A triumphant smirk crossed Ellis's face. He assumed he had just caught the prankster who had been terrorizing the security guards. He quickly threw open his car door, jumped out, and sprinted up the embankment toward the bridge, ready to make an arrest. But as he reached the top and shone his heavy police flashlight onto the structure, he let out a sigh of disappointment. There was no prankster. It was just a large, heavy piece of black industrial tarpaulin caught on a piece of rebar violently flapping back and forth in the wind. Ellis chuckled to himself, shook his head at the absurdity of it all, and walked back down the embankment. He climbed back into the driver's seat of the Vauxhall Astra and closed the door. He looked over at Beat and smiled. Just a piece of tarp, John. Mystery solved. They both relaxed, sinking back into their seats, ready to call it a night and head back to the station. But less than 10 seconds later, the atmosphere inside the patrol car changed with violent, unnatural speed. The ambient temperature inside the vehicle plummeted so rapidly that both officers physically shivered. The air grew incredibly heavy, thick, and difficult to breathe. PC Ellis felt an intense, icy chill crawl up his spine, raising the hairs on the back of his neck. He swallowed hard, the smirk completely gone from his face. He slowly turned his head toward Beat. His voice was trembling as he spoke. John, I just got the oddest sensation. It feels like someone just walked over my grave. Beat nodded slowly, his eyes wide. He could feel it too. An oppressive, suffocating presence had suddenly descended upon the car. Acting on pure instinct, PC Ellis slowly turned his head to look out his open driver's side window. Standing immediately outside the car, mere inches from Ellis's face, was a figure. But Ellis couldn't see a face. He couldn't see arms or legs. All he saw, pressed horrifyingly close to the door of the car, was a dark-clothed torso. The fabric was coarse and heavy, like ancient sackcloth, and stitched directly into the center of the chest area was a stark, bright white letter V. Ellis's brain completely short-circuited. He stared at the impossible, headless torso hovering right beside his window, paralyzing fear flooding his veins. Before Ellis could even draw breath to scream, the torso vanished. It didn't step back. It just blinked out of existence. A microsecond later, Special Constable Beat let out a blood-curdling shout of sheer terror from the passenger seat. Ellis whipped his head to the right. The exact same dark torso, with the stark white V on the chest, was now hovering directly outside Beat's open passenger window, completely ignoring the physical space it would take to travel around the vehicle. The sheer impossibility of the sight broke Ellis from his paralysis. His police training completely evaporated, replaced entirely by the primal, desperate urge to survive. He reached down, grabbed the keys in the ignition, and violently twisted them. The engine cranked, but it didn't start. Panic completely consumed the officers. Ellis twisted the key again, his hand shaking violently. Nothing. The reliable police cruiser was completely dead. Both officers later reported that in this moment, the fear they felt was unlike anything they had ever experienced in the line of duty. It wasn't the fear of a criminal with a weapon. It was an overwhelming, supernatural dread, a feeling of absolute, paralyzing doom that they had zero control over. Ellis pumped the gas pedal frantically, pleading with the machine, and twisted the key a third time. Finally, the engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. Ellis didn't hesitate. He slammed the gear shift into drive and stomped his foot down hard on the accelerator. The Vauxhall Astra lurched forward, kicking up dirt and gravel as it desperately tried to gain traction. But as the car surged forward, attempting to escape the bridge, an impossibly loud, violently destructive noise erupted from the back of the vehicle. Bang! The sound was deafening. It sounded exactly as if a massive, incredibly strong man had just taken a full-force swing with a solid wooden baseball bat directly against the trunk of the police cruiser. The physical impact was so immense that the entire back end of the car lifted up, violently rocking the vehicle forward and backward on its suspension, throwing the officers against their seatbelts. Ellis didn't look in the rearview mirror. He kept his foot pinned to the floor, steering the rocking, bouncing patrol car away from the Pea Royd Bridge and tearing down the dirt road back towards civilization, leaving the suffocating darkness behind them. When they finally arrived back at the Deep Car police station, they were a mess. Their colleagues were stunned to see these two respected, level-headed officers, physically shaking, pale, and completely terrified. Despite the potential ridicule, PC, Dick Ellis, and Special Constable John Beat sat down and wrote out an official, detailed police report documenting their paranormal encounter on the Stocksbridge Bypass. They went on the record, risking their professional reputations, because they knew exactly what they had experienced. Months later, on Friday, May 13th, 1988, the £14 million Stocksbridge Bypass finally opened to the public. The massive engineering project was complete. The heavy lorries were successfully diverted from the small town of Stocksbridge, and traffic began to flow at high speeds over the newly paved, pristine highway. But the opening of the road did absolutely nothing to quell the horrors that plagued it. In fact, giving the public access to the cursed land only amplified the nightmare. Almost immediately, the A616 gained a horrific reputation. Within its first decade of operation, the road saw a staggering 14 fatal accidents and hundreds of serious injuries, earning it the grim moniker of the Killer Road. Authorities blamed the high accident rate on the road's design, the sudden drops in elevation, and the heavy fog that frequently blankets the moors. But for the men and women who drive the road in the dead of night, the explanations are far more terrifying. To satisfy the modern demands of commerce, heavy lorry drivers are constantly on the road, hauling massive cargo loads through the night to avoid daytime traffic. These drivers are professionals. They are used to long, lonely hours, dark roads, and the tricks that exhaustion can play on the eyes. They sit high up in their cabs, commanding multi-ton machines that take the length of a football field to safely come to a complete stop. The stretch of the Stocksbridge Bypass through the Peak District is incredibly isolated. There are no streetlights for miles. On a moonless night, the only light comes from the powerful beams of the lorry's headlights, cutting through the oppressive, swirling fog. It is a terrifyingly common occurrence for a veteran lorry driver to be rumbling down the A616 at 3 a.m., the massive diesel engine humming, the cab completely silent, when suddenly the headlights illuminate something impossible in the middle of the pitch-black highway. Right there, standing on the dividing line of the fast-moving roadway, are young children. The drivers report seeing them with horrific clarity. Sometimes it's a single little girl in a tattered dress looking lost and confused. Other times, it is a group of children holding hands, seemingly playing a game or singing in a circle, entirely oblivious to the multi-ton wall of steel bearing down on them at 60 miles per hour. The reaction of the drivers is immediate, visceral, and violently panicked. Believing with every fiber of their being that they are about to crush a group of innocent children, the drivers stand on the air brakes. The massive tires lock up. Thick white smoke billows from the rubber as the heavy lorries violently skid and swerve across the asphalt, the heavy cargo shifting ominously behind them. The sound of screeching tires echoes through the empty valley. The massive trucks finally grind to a violently shuddering halt, often stopping just inches from where the children were standing in the headlights. The drivers, their hearts pounding out of their chests, drenched in a cold sweat, immediately grab their CB radios or mobile phones. They dial emergency services in a state of absolute frantic panic. Police! I need police on the A616 immediately. I almost just hit a group of kids. They're playing in the middle of the road in the pitch black. The response is always rapid. Police cruisers, their blue lights flashing, tear up the bypass, sirens wailing. They arrive at the scene to find the massive lorry parked diagonally across the road, the driver standing outside, trembling, pointing frantically to the empty asphalt. The officers shut down the lanes. They pull out their heavy, high-powered flashlights. They sweep the road. They climb down the steep, treacherous embankments on either side of the highway. They check the drainage ditches. They deploy thermal imaging cameras to scan the freezing moors for the heat signatures of terrified, lost children. And every single time, without fail, they find absolutely nothing. There are no footprints on the soft shoulders of the road. There is no evidence of a broken down family vehicle nearby. There are no thermal signatures in the brush. There is no physical trace that anyone had been standing there at all. The children simply do not exist. This intensely traumatic experience has happened so repeatedly to so many different, unconnected lorry drivers over the decades that it has become a dark legend within the trucking community. Many veteran drivers, tough men who have driven across the entirety of Europe without an ounce of fear, flat out refuse to take the Stocksbridge Bypass after the sun goes down. Instead of saving time by taking the direct route, they will intentionally pull their massive rigs into laybys and truck stops miles away, opting to sleep in their cabs until the morning light breaks, rather than risk seeing the ghostly Victorian children playing in the middle of the dark highway. Today, the A616 remains a vital artery for traffic flowing through South Yorkshire. Thousands of cars and heavy goods vehicles pass over Pea Royd Bridge every single day. In the bright light of a summer afternoon, it looks like any other modern highway cutting through the English countryside. But when the sun dips below the hills and the thick, freezing fog rolls off the moors to blanket the asphalt, the atmosphere of the road changes. The history of the unhallowed ground, the tragic legacy of the child miners, and the sheer volume of horrific paranormal events recorded by credible, professional witnesses, from frightened security guards to deeply shaken police officers to traumatized lorry drivers, hangs heavy in the air. The Stocksbridge Bypass stands as a chilling monument to the idea that sometimes, when we tear deeply into the earth to build our modern world, we disturb things that were meant to remain buried forever. This is the Stocksbridge Bypass, a modern road built over ancient trauma, where the past refuses to stay buried. It makes you wonder what else we might wake up when we dig too deep. If that ride down the A616 sent a shiver down your spine, go ahead and hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed to Channel 19 Mysteries so you never miss a journey into the unknown. Down in the comments, let me know, would you be brave enough to drive that stretch of road alone at 3 a.m.? And speaking of lonely roads, I want to hear your stories. If you've had a brush with the unexplained, send it over to mycreepyencounter@gmail.com. Your nightmare might just be our next episode. I'm your host, Midnight Rider. Keep your high beams on and stay safe out there.